Hey there, gunfighters. I think it's time we do another episode on truck guns. Recently did a long series on that. Today we're going to do wild cards. We covered the broad categories, but what about the outliers? What about getting a little bit crazy with your truck gun? I don't mean crazy as in bad. I mean crazy as in just not an AR, right? Just something different. Not a standard loadout. What about the others? What about the wild cards? That's what we're going to talk about today on Gunfighter Life, the podcast where we talk about guns, gunfighting tactics, use of deadly force the right way with Almighty God at the center, Judeo-Christian values, and real-world first-hand experience. Hopefully you'll forgive the subpar audio quality. This is getting recorded on my cracked and broken in several places iPhone, but it's kind of a throwback from days of yore. If you remember the first several years of Gunfighter Life, where I recorded on my phone when I was still a professional gunfighter. I think I started the podcast when I was a private contractor for a 3-letter government agency I won't specify, and then for the commander of a tactical team to stop active shooters. Never record on my phone, only a couple of times a year. But today I'm headed out to the range to do some rifle work, get some data on rifles and ammo and what they like. And hopefully, by God's grace, it'll be a blessed day at the range. So I thought, why not get this episode out while it's on the brain? Truck guns, wild cards. Let's get into it. Okay, so we've covered the broad categories. The PCC is a truck gun, the full-size fighting handgun, maybe plus size, the big girls of the handgun world. We've done that whole genre. If you haven't seen that, go back and listen. The AR, the AK-47 for truck guns. What about the outliers? Here's one. What about the little bitty baby of the truck guns, the 22 long rifle? Now, this was one of my truck guns up until recently when it got stolen. Sadly, when I went to Alaska, if you haven't heard, my wife and I parked in a guarded with people and gated place in Washington to store our truck when we went to Alaska. Still got broken into, still got the gun taken out of the back. This was one of the guns that I kept in the back of the truck was a Ruger 10/22 takedown, and it was all kitted up, sadly. It was really good, had the good sights on it, had the good everything, but it's a good option for a truck gun, and here's why it stayed in the truck along with some other guns. I often talk about, you guys might not, but I often talk about what's the best survival gun if you can only have one long gun for the end of the world. And it often comes down to the shotgun versus the 22. And the big proponents of the 22 say the 22 is because you can carry so much ammo. So here's the thing, if you don't know, my wife and I live as neo-nomads, sojourners on this earth, as we all are, but we very practically so. We live large chunks off the grid, traveling around right now in the beautiful mountains of northern Idaho. And what happens is if a truck broke down, whatever happened, it was the end of days as we know them. You get stuck in a city in gridlock and you got your Lamborghinis, right? You got your bug out bag and your Lamborghinis and you got to walk. And my best chance is to walk to my nearest known bug out location. Now, if you guys were patrons, you'd have a lot of my bug out locations literally pinned on maps. So maybe I'd see you there when the peanut butter and chocolate hits the fan. But let's say my nearest thing is 500 miles. Well, better get on the Lamborghinis, put the pack on Alexander Hamilton or Rhodesian Ridgeback, grab the bug out bag, and start hoofing it. In that case, the 22 long rifle excels because I can literally carry 1,000 rounds of ammo easily. Can't do that with pretty much anything else. So you might consider that for your truck gun. Is it the best for defense? No. Is it better than harsh words? For sure. Reasonable rate of fire. If I was going this way, I would go semi-auto. I mean, it's hard to argue anything other than a 10/22 if you have, something else that you really, really like. If you want to go uber light and you might be doing a lot of aquatic type stuff, you may look at the Henry A.R.s because it floats. So if you plan on bugging out in a canoe or something like that, or just do a lot of water crossing, or you want to save the weight and you really, really are not a gunfighter, maybe you're listening to the wrong podcast, but it is just a food procurement device, a tool for procuring food. You might look at like the Henry A.R.s. I don't think the sustained rate of fire and the reliability is there, or the accuracy, although I might be wrong on the accuracy, compared to the Ruger 10/22. But it's a solid option, the semi-auto. I like mine configured at least with good backup iron sights, as most 1022s come with. You may or may not decide to run an optic. If I was going to run an optic, if it's for hard times use, nothing that takes batteries or that needs batteries, I would go with like a prism sight over a red dot, because if the battery fails, I can still use the reticle in the prism. So just something like that. Maybe you want to go with a fixed power, very small, lightweight optic. But there you go. If you want the creme de la creme of this world, you may look at the Tactical Solutions options. They make some really good stuff. But the 22, for sure, as a truck gun, and you may pair that with, sadly, as I did, one of my go-to 22 handguns in one of the pouches. If you don't know, the Ruger 1022 Takedown comes with a bag, and you can fit a handgun in that bag. So you could have a handgun option and a long gun option. It doesn't weigh a lot in its own bag that you can just grab and go. So you might consider that for a truck gun option. Okay, let's go from mild to wild. We talked about the AR, and I generally talked about that in the vanilla, the Breyers Vanilla 223-556. What if you want to get big? How about the 458 SOCOM? Now, you would know about this if you're a patron. I did Guns for Sasquatch. That's right. Guns to take on Bigfoot. I do a lot of fun episodes. I get a little more loose with the patrons. I've done one on the zombie apocalypse, one on Guns for Bigfoot. But I talked about the 458 SOCOM. I worked once, I was the manager of a firearms and training company, and there were some guys there that were crushing hard on the 458 SOCOM. They had 458 SOCOMs. They loved the 458 SOCOM. I will concede that of the big bores, it's probably the best ballistically of like the 450 Bushmaster, the 458 SOCOM, the 500 Beowulf, or 50 Beowulf. Right, of the big bore ARs, the 458 SOCOM is a good option. Why? Why would you choose this for a truck gun when you lose so much capacity? Well, if it's good enough to take out a Sasquatch, it's probably good for going through car doors. If you're talking about a truck gun where you are likely to shoot through your car and into somebody else's car, that's a real thing if you do any kind of like real world training or real world scenarios. Like vehicle rammings are a thing. People take cover behind cars. Well, turn the cover into concealment with the 458 SOCOM. They make some pretty legit solid copper monolithic bullets made for this purpose, for like deep penetration on all kinds of obstacles. So get rid of those obstacles in your path, as oh brother, where art thou would say. So the 458 SOCOM, you still got your common AR platform. You can put good triggers in it. There's so many options for the AR, but maybe you want it in a big, beefy, knockdown, drag-out cartridge, the 458 SOCOM. So that's kind of a wild card there. Now, let us go from the more urban to the more rural, I would say. How about the Scout rifle? The good old Jeff Cooper can take a buffalo and, keep you alive out in the bush gun. The kind of designed as a practical rifle, a kind of do-it-all Swiss Army knife, if you want to call it that, the multi-tool of rifles. Okay. Especially if you live in a place where your shall not be infringed rights have in fact been infringed, where you can't have a high-capacity semi-auto. If you're like in Canada, where, I don't know the laws everywhere, but if it's not a semi-auto, there's no magazine ban limit, I don't think. So do you want a 5-round SKS, or do you want, I think that's what they're limited to. I know a regular SKS is 10 rounds, but I'm talking for the Maple Leaf guys up north in the Great White North. Do you want a 5-round SKS? Yeah, it's semi-auto. You get 5 rounds, which is not horrible. It's not a horrible choice. Or do you want a Scout rifle in 308 that's a bolt action where you can have as many rounds in the magazine as you want? And it depends on where you live, right? If I live, downtown Toronto, I'm probably going to pick the SKS. If I live in, 2 hours north of Calgary, I'm probably picking the Scout rifle. Geography plays a big part in that. especially if you talk about really cold climates at the far upper north end, like up near the Arctic Circle in Canada or places, where you might have to crush some ice with your bolt. I'd pick a nice controlled round feed scout rifle for that. Different environments, right? So the scout rifle for the truck gun, or maybe you travel all up and down the Northeast, where you go from shall not be infringed, live free or die, as I did live in New Hampshire for a bit. I don't know if I can claim that but I lived there a fairly decent amount of time. I was also the head firearms and training instructor there for a gun company for a while. Live free or die state. You live there, but you got to go through a bunch of really infringy places where it's just so infringy it's not even funny. For that, maybe a scout rifle, right? Maybe that's a good option for you, because I don't know anywhere except for like Ohio where you have to hunt. But as far as having one in your vehicle, if you can have a gun, I don't know anywhere that restricts bolt action rifles. So you may look at the Scout if you want that idea, but you don't want a 308. They make what the community, the Scout rifle community, and I don't want to use the wrong word. They're a passionate group. How about that? They also refer to the smaller ones as Cub Scouts. You can get these smaller versions in 5.56. There are several options like the Mossberg MVP and things like that are Scout-ish. They would argue maybe that they're not true Scouts, but they call them a Cub Scout in 5.56. So if you want that and you want an intermediate cartridge, you might look at something like a Cub Scout, especially if you're somewhere like really remote Southwest where you're not dealing with big bears and things like that. The Southwest, you might run into some coyotes, some javelina, but that's really it. And the 5.56 will do fine for that. You want to carry more ammo if you have to cross big deserts on foot. You might decide to go with the lighter option. So either the Scout or the Cub Scout for a wild card. How's this for the wild card? The lever action, right? And I'm not talking about the abomination lever action of the lever action that had a baby with an AR. I'm talking about your old school lever actions. We talked about the bruiser of the 458 SOCOM. How about a 45-70 for a truck gun, lever action? You know, there's a certain subset of the community that are very passionate about the 45-70, much like the Scout rifles are with the Scout rifle. You know, the 45-70, you live in real thick, dense areas, but you want a bruiser of a cartridge where long shots are not a big deal. Now, I know people that love the 45-70 say, it'll kill a buffalo at 1,000 yards. It will if you have a known distance and you're walking in rounds and you have time to figure out the distance, but practically it's a shorter range cartridge. But talking about going through vehicles, it's a big, heavy, moderate velocity bullet, and with proper bullet construction, those tend to penetrate pretty well. So especially if you make your own ammo, load your own, there's a lot of versatility in a 45-70. You can go from mild to wild in that cartridge, unlike the 458 SOCOM where you need a certain amount of power to cycle the weapon. The lever action doesn't, so you can go from mild to wild. If you want a little bit higher rate of fire and not so much of a bruiser on the shoulder, you can load them pretty mild, like original loadings, trapdoor loadings, or you can go hot and heavy. So 45-70 as a truck gun. Now the ammo is heavy, but hey, if we're talking wild cards here, you might love the 45-70, and more power to you. You also may want to go into lever action in a more moderate cartridge, but still really good. The classic 30-30, it's a good, I would call that, and I think I did a whole episode and I called it America's first intermediate cartridge. You want a good intermediate cartridge, rock solid for medium-sized game, for defense. The 30-30, you know, whether you're talking about the 150 or up into the 170 or even heavier now bullets, it's a good performing cartridge. So 30-30 is awesome. Also, some really good options are the 44 Magnum /44 Special or the 357 Magnum /38 Special. That's probably the way that I would go if I were looking for a lever action truck gun. I just think there's a lot of versatility there in that cartridge. It may be one of the most versatile cartridges, period. And especially if you're a 357 guy anyway. A 357 lever action truck gun, you know, there's nothing heretical about putting like a more modern optic on the top, like the prism optic we talked about, something like that. Whether you're talking like the Vortex prism, I forget what they call it, maybe the Spitfire, or if you're talking like a primary arms, etched reticle optic. That way, if the batteries go out or something, or you don't even need batteries, but you can still get that fast firing capability, which lends itself to the lever action. That's a pretty cool wild card. And again, especially if you live in somewhere that's a little bit more infringy, that might be a good option, even if you don't live there. But the lever action, I think, is a pretty good wild card option. Here is one I'm gonna how about just your deer rifle? Instead of keeping it in a safe at home, why not keep it in your truck? You might think that's ridiculous. You could never use that for some kind of tactical scenario. Well, I would like to give you a little history lesson, not to be condescending, but you may not realize it. But what I would consider America's first active shooter was the bell tower shooter in Texas. And this happened at, I think, a college, some kind of scholastic facility. And this far predates Columbine. This is back in the day, as the kids say. Back in the day, there was an active shooter, bell tower shooter, shooting on a campus. And a cop who realizes what's happening and a citizen who realizes what's happening, the citizen grabs his scope rifle, I presume some kind of deer rifle, right, a full-powered rifle, scoped rifle, and goes up to the cop who, I guess, deputizes him on the spot. And as the lure goes, check this for yourself, the guy says one of the coolest lines, if you're ever getting deputized, that I think has ever been uttered. And he looks at the cop, or says to the cop, "Are we playing for keeps?" That's the attitude we need to have. If it's time to change somebody's behavior, if they're doing evil things, it's time to change their behavior. But, what an American hero there that probably doesn't get the respect that he deserves. But if you look up the bell tower shooting, and that armed citizen and that cop joined forces and took out that bell tower shooter. They played for keeps. So I would say it's not ridiculous to think that a good classic bolt action full powered scoped hunting rifle is a decent option. It's certainly better than nothing. And if you already have one, there's nothing wrong with, even what I would call a fairly pedestrian 308 or 6.5 Creedmoor. It doesn't have to be crazy expensive. Savage Axis are crazy accurate in my experience. I've never seen one that was not a tack driver. Get a Savage Axis with whatever scope you want on there, good solid mounts. You're probably still into it less than $500. Well, I don't know with inflation, but probably, or if you want to go the Ruger American route, they're kind of one of the go-tos for budget rifles, or what's another big one? The Tikka T3, right? You get one of those, maybe even a compact model, but whatever you're comfortable with, right? If you have taken, a dozen deer with said deer rifle, it obviously shows that you're probably pretty competent with that rifle. Instead of keeping it locked up in a gun safe 11 months out of the year, why not get some kind of decent case or gun sock and keep it in the truck, right? I mean, you're talking about saving human life. So anyway, that's my last wild card there. The rifle that you're familiar with, that you put food on the table with, could also be a good option to protect yourself and your loved ones. And obviously it's good for putting meat on the table if it's your go-to putting meat on the table gun. So just some thoughts on wild cards for truck guns there.